inspiration. They become very large ships, not that don't move very easily. And so one of the amazing things about COVID is that it really has presented an opportunity for us to dislocate in order to relocate and reset our relationship to institutions, including museums, and really reseed them from their origin. Like, what does it mean to sit with our inspiration, to sit with our minds, and also to sit with the mountain, to sit with the land, to reconnect to place. So this interconnection between inspiration and place is actually built into the word museum, because muses in the ancient frame of reference in the ancient Greek mind, where this word came from, you could connect to the muses through the mountain. And many of her shrines were built into mountains. And so we have a unique opportunity to reinvent how the museum exists in our minds, our cities, and our culture. And so that's the process that we're just starting to undertake with Museum of Craft and Design. We're sharing parts of that process with the public, including in this afternoon's workshop. And so today we're going to be mapping the intersection between our minds, our cities, and our cultures in this post-COVID reality. And so we're going to be doing two mapping processes today, which I'll speak more about later, but that's the general arc. And what's amazing is that Museum of Craft and Design, and why we're working with them, is they've been really investigating these questions for some time now. And they actually did a project with the Ohlone leaders, two local Ohlone tribe representatives and Cafe Ohlone, that used clay to create, it was actually an MCD home kit, which Charlotte will share at the end of this presentation. You can do at home. Just start to become aware of the original regions according to Ohlone nations and languages, recognizing Bay Area groups. And so this process, the reason why this workshop is called counter mapping is because we're honoring this movement that's already been happening for about 30, 40 years. Counter mapping was coined in the 70s. And it's really starting with the indigenous, you can say, environmental and social justice issues around how we are all on indigenous land. I'm calling in from Los Angeles, formerly Chumash land. But that's just the beginning. What do you do with that acknowledgement? What is the implication of acknowledging that the land was not always what it appears to be now? And how do those past histories influence the present and the future? And so counter mapping historically refers to the efforts, not just of indigenous, but in general mapping efforts and processes that go against or counter dominant power structures. The term was coined by Nancy Peluso, not in the 70s, in 1995, actually in a process of commissioning maps in Indonesia. And so what are the dominant power structures? For me, when I think of dominant power structures in the SF Bay Area, where I lived for 7 to 8 years, I just moved to LA, but I'm back and forth all the time. I think of the tech companies, right? Think of Google Maps. Like Google Maps if anyone's the first thing someone does before they go to Museum of Craft and Design is they Google Map it, right? That's like it's really like the first thing people see of your museum. Mm-hmm. Right, Charlotte?
Yeah. I mean, it's like the first step that we do for anything anymore, right? It's kind of
map it. And I've just paired it with another SF Bay Area mapping consciousness, which is Stamen Design, and they've been really influential in the conversations around map making. And it would be hard to even do this workshop without acknowledging the impact of their work. So this is one of their mapping projects that uses OpenStreetMap's data source, and it's created these watercolor tiles that was just acquired by the Smithsonian like a month ago. And so they used to be this alternative map, but now that they've been bought by the Smithsonian, you could say they've been institutionalized as well. But their process is very much It's almost like a Google Map alternative, but deeper than that, creating different ways for people to interface, to create their own maps, to give these tools of seeing and mapping to increase the accessibility. And here's a quote from Eric Rodenbeck, founder of Stamen Design. "There's no such thing as a neutral or objective map. Maps are always leaving something out for everything that they include." So I really love that quote, and also the work that Stamen Design has done over the last 15, 20 years. And they've done a lot of work within the community, and I've been looking at some of those projects, and this one is quite amazing. They went to a school called Brightworks, and this is an 8-year-old's pigeon and pastry project using Google Maps and Stamen Maps. But the question here really is, well, what did they leave out? And my first thought when I saw this map was, well, they left out the pigeons. And so for an 8-year-old, she was inspired by Stamen's presentation to their school, and she started to map. Her big question was, do bakeries and pigeons relate to each other? And her big question, do pigeons like croissants more or chocolate? And so she did a series of studies and maps. She made this little map of looking at the different locations of La Boulange using the Stamen map, and creating her own sort of phenomenal, I think it's a pretty phenomenal project for an 8-year-old, and very ambitious, to create like an alternate reality of like, well, what does San Francisco look like from the perspective of pigeons and pastries? And just to really be playful about counter mapping. It's not necessarily serious. I mean, it is serious. The issues around Indigenous trauma and healing are serious, but there's also just a lot of ways to re-engage play. Here are some more projects. So these were submitted to Mapping and Its Discontents, which was a symposium that I participated in 2013 at UC Berkeley. And one of the maps that was really well received was this OpenStreetMap submitted by Alan McConchie, who's now a lead designer at Stamen. Every line ever, every point ever. And so what he did here was, I mean, you can see, it's a very simple premise. Every single line, historically, in the historical data that had been drawn on OpenStreetMap or found, is presented, even if they were deleted. So like all the past pathways that have been taken in the digital interface are revealed to create a different understanding of transparency. And as exciting as this project is, it also is very revealing as to how my first question that Eric, asked is, well, what's left out? Because this map claims that it's every line ever, but obviously it's not. It's impossible to put every line ever on a map, and every map is as telling for what it leaves out as what it puts in. Because it's only every line ever that's been recorded, of course, in a digital map. What about animals? What about indigenous peoples? What about the history of the land before internet? It's not like the Bay Area only existed when the internet mapped it. And so it just reminds me constantly when I see these maps and these titles for these maps, as brilliant as they are, there's also a blind spot that we need to be looking at and talking about. And that's for me the essence of counter mapping. And so it reminds me of Vincent Scully's quote, which is this collective blindness that we have, the blindness of the contemporary urban world to everything that is not itself. In other words, not on Google Maps. To everything that is not itself, to nature most of all, is a highly dangerous condition. And that's from his book on Greek sacred architecture. And I feel very fortunate to have studied with him at Yale University, where he taught, and to just be able to receive his insights about architecture and landscape in several of his courses. And this is actually one of the Greek temples that I visited in Sicily, Segesta. And so I was able, when I visited these temples during my time abroad in Italy, I was able to actually experience what he's talking about in Earth, Temple, and the Gods. The seat of the muse, the mountain, our relationship to landscape, where these words that we use come from. And these concepts, they're not just ideas, they're part of our collective psyche and culture. And we have an opportunity now to revisit where they came from and to countermap some of the very limiting belief systems of our contemporary urban reality. Like these two images seem so incongruous. And so what we're going to work on today and introduce as countermapping is what we call phenomenal data in Make Conscious. So looking beyond the visible, right? So this map, every line ever, every point ever, parentheses, in a Cartesian worldview that we can map on the internet, which is a fraction of reality, unparentheses, close parentheses, right? So how do we expand beyond the visible, right? So that map is just this tiny 1/8 of the quadrant, the visible. What about the audible, the sounds of the city, the tangible, what the textures of the city, the fathomable, what we can even grok about the city? And then the invisible, the inaudible, the intangible, the unfathomable. And so all of these different ways of understanding place become, you can say, in play when we talk about countermapping. And so the map that I have in the back here is by a Zuni artist. It's called The Migration of the Salt Mother. And it's a project that the Zuni Museum is doing right now on countermapping. And one of the elders, Jim, he writes that modern maps don't have memory. For me, the whole landscape around here is home. I have pattern languages that help me to remember how I get from one place to another. And in Emergence magazine, Chelsea writes that Zuni maps remind us that modern conventional maps convey only one very particular way of being in place, one which often counterintuitively leaves us disoriented and disconnected. Conventional maps do not tell us what it means to be somewhere. And what I find so interesting about COVID is that it actually helped reveal to us some of the problems with our conventional ways of placing ourselves. And so these countermapping examples and projects that are currently happening around the world, for me, really connect us back to Genius Loci's spirit of place and open up phenomenal data collection processes, things that are unfathomable, right? The Salt Mother, the migration of the Salt Mother is probably unfathomable to those of us who have not been steeped in the mythology and the traditions of the Zuni peoples. Intangible, inaudible, invisible. Stories are invisible, but they are audible. Some of them are fathomable, but a lot of them are unfathomable. How do we map all of that? How does that imbue the process of mapping the meaning? So countermapping is really, I'd say, countering our tendency to subjugate everything to the rational and the Cartesian understanding of the world, when it's so much more. And so one of the things that you do with phenomenal data, these are the processes that we do in Make Conscious. We bring everything through the structures of consciousness, right? So these 10 levels of consciousness, all of them are interconnected. So we can meet a project anywhere. We can meet a map anywhere. You can see we're meeting that view of the environment. But what I love about Migration of the Salt Mother and this beautiful indigenous map is it weaves through all these structures of consciousness. It weaves through the body. It weaves through the environment. It weaves through emotion, mind, energy, cosmos. You can see all the different moments of her psyche that you're weaving through the pattern language in the earth. It's non-linear. It transcends time. It moves through place and time. And then there's this feather, and there's actually more that can't fit on the page. And somehow you know that she knows her way through it. A few more other maps as precedents to inspire our practice today. Omar Mishmar, I really enjoy his work. We were both presenting at the mapping symposium, and I met him in grad school. He made this amazing map about being gay in Beirut. And it's called A Hands Routine. And it's illegal to be gay in Beirut. And as a gay male, his gay space, his queer space was the car, right? And there's the mapping of like where he could be gay and like hold hands with his lover and then like leave and like go back into the car. And it's like the whole language, the whole experience of being queer in a place where it's not allowed. And so there's that whole counter mapping, that we can look at. The city and its people become a threat, forcing us to choose, unhold, and be like any two straight guys in a car, or stay holding and come out to the whole city. And so this is an amazing map. We can look at it online. And then a little bit about just my own mapping processes. I spent 1.5 years in silence, and during that time, I mapped my mind in many, many different ways, which I'm not going to go into right now. But in a nutshell, mapping my body and mapping the landscape merged. So these are just a few of little snippets of work that I did. There's one watercolor of the map, a picture of the map, and then a portrait of my body sort of dissolving into the mountain, and then a map of the whole retreat, and then the Chinese character for think, which has been influencing me since the day I was born, and which I really use as a way of understanding what it means to be phenomenal as a container. And so that Chinese character for think is the ancient understanding of the mind, pre-Cartesian carving up of reality, right? So right now, what is real? Whatever in Google Maps is real. We need to dismantle that because it's too limiting a frame for what is real, and it discounts other realities. This ancient way of understanding consciousness is made of 3 parts. Underneath is the heart. The thing that looks like a tree is a tree. The thing that looks, right, the roots are underground and the branches are reaching up, and the earth level is the middle of the character. And then on the right, you have the eye. And so the eye stands for the 5 elements. The eye stands for the 5 senses. The tree stands for the 5 elements. And so it's this intersection between your sense powers and the elements of nature that you perceive through your perception. All of that phenomenal data is held over the heart organ, the heart. The heart is the mind, your embodied experience of those, and those become your conscious frame. And so for me, that time in meditation was just learning how to be in that ancient space. And I could feel my, Yale architecture programming being dismantled. And just sitting where I sat for 1.5 years in the Chiricahua Mountains in Apache land, 30 minutes from Geronimo's Vision Quest. And it allowed me to taste what an ancient mind might feel like. I actually did these maps before my silent retreat, but I think they're a nice bridge between the Cartesian structures and my practice of self transformation. So this is the map that was also part of the Mapping and Its Discontent Symposium that a lot of these maps I've been showing were shown in. And so this is a map I made of my daily yoga practice. So for each breath, I drew the pose, and I created a landscape of movement and self-transformation. So I created these glyphs, these textures that are the accumulation of those postures over time. And so the map moved horizontally, like a film, depending on the poses that I did that morning. And then I also had it transcend vertically to create these accumulations, accumulations of energy and practice. And it started to create a phenomenal data set of my own personal journey into self. And I always think of the work of Bachelard when I look at this type of inquiry and his description of intimate immensity. the journey inward opens up this immense field. Now here's another map that I made, Machine of the Body. And similarly, it's made of a similar language of different postures. And then at the center are the different sounds of the Sanskrit alphabet that are said to resonate at different areas in the body. And this is all pre-make conscious. And then I wanted to just show one of our colleagues' work, Marissa Naughton's work, which I'm really excited about. So she's a landscape architect, landscape designer. We're working on several projects right now. And this is just one of our residential projects. And when we do an intake, we do all sorts of, we combine meditating with the land with our own site analysis. So I wanted to show you her 2 base plans, right? So here's her CAD drawing, same person, same process, probably done within the same week, you know, coming up with a base plan. And then we met the gnomes of the land, journeying into that space and understanding how the gnomes of the land, the spirits of the land, play. The big tree and the tunnel that they have underneath, and bringing that whimsy that the pigeons and the pastry bring to the land. And how we're not the only people, we're not the only beings that are living here. And instead of ruling the land like it was only a human interface, becoming stewards of the land that holds the stories of many, many, many creatures, many of which we can't actually understand at all. And so it reminds me of one of the sayings in the Vastu Shastra, the Vedic architecture, which is that the Vedic architect, the sacred architect, knew how to leave 50% or more to God. In other words, designing for the unfathomable, understanding that most of what we're designing, we don't actually know. And most of what we're mapping, we can't actually see. And so with that in mind, we can start our mapping exercise. So we're going to try that, combining the elements, the senses over our hearts. And the only thing you need to do to counter map is to give yourself permission to see something else. And so this is a quote from Vincent Scully. Human beings see selectively, not empirically. They see what the conceptual structure of their culture permits them to see, and they only see new things when that existing cultural model is broken. So we invite you to give yourself permission to break the existing cultural model of Google Maps. So I'm going to start with a little meditation, and then we're going to map what we see. So the first map that I'm going to take you through is mapping our COVID reality. So looking at, we all went through this past year, sort of the intersections between virtual and real, and we all experienced the hybrid reality. What did that do to change how you even place yourself in your home? So before you start drawing, just close your eyes for a moment and sit. Sit in front of your screen, in front of your phone, the way you've been sitting for your Zoom meetings over the past year. And find that central beginning point of your map, right? The origin point. Notice where you are in space. Notice where you are in time. And give yourself permission to listen a little bit deeper. See where you are in your home. Where is your home in your neighborhood? Visualize it in your mind's eye. And the first lens we're going to place on is how the past year has altered the paths that you've even taken in your neighborhood. Over the past year, when everything was shut down, where did you go? Where could you not go? Your favorite restaurants closed. See how the map of your neighborhood was altered over the course of the last year. And where did you go instead? Hiking? Supermarket? You know, there was an article in the LA Times about how Erewhon became the hip spot because only supermarkets were open. So somehow supermarkets became where you were seen. Hang out with your friends. So for you, where did you create secret gathering places with your friends or not? You respected social distancing rules. And just feeling how your physical landscape has been altered. And even as it reopens, are you returning to those places, right? You used to go to those museums. Well, they're reopened now. Have you gone back? So that visualization is your base plan for your past year. Now, on that base plan, layer the virtual layer. It's like, whoa. Where in your home did you drop in to your calls, your meetings? It's like you created portals to the virtual realm within your physical realm. You consciously created them. That's your Zoom spot. You might have several Zoom spots. And create that bubble of a container nestled within your physical world. How do the two intersect? In time and in space, how did those two intersect? And then that virtual world that opened up. Drop inside that interdimensional space. And what did your Zoom days feel like? Where did you go? Who did you speak with? How were you connected through those portals? And how did they find their way back to physical locations? COVID accelerated a hybrid reality. And so at any point, you can start to draw what you saw, either working backwards from the virtual or starting with a physical base plan. Or you can stay in the visualization space as you keep receiving the phenomenal data. And keep feeling it as you experienced it. Allow the realities to intermingle and generate their own language. Your own deeply personal expression. So you can start with that origin point where you're sitting right now, or you can start with that end point, or you can start in the middle. And as you draw, as you map, you'll find that you're adding detail or even changing some of the insights that you just received. And you're creating your own data set. So the word data comes from the Latin datum, which means that which has been received. So see if you can bypass the part of your brain that needs to understand what you're mapping and just keep receiving what you received. So you're staying in that intuitive flow and not trying to make sense of it. Yet. That comes after. So if you started with a base plan, your physical location, you can layer on the virtual now. If you started with the virtual, you can start to weave in the physical. And look at how they're starting to weave together on the page. Your map of 2020. And start to finish it up. This is just a little warm-up exercise. And if anybody wants to share, we're going to do another mapping exercise, but if anybody wants to share what you've just drawn, just email it to me and I'll put it on the screen. I would love to see. Or if you don't want me to put it on the screen, just send an email. Do not put this on the screen, but I'd like you to look at it and smile. Charlotte, you want to show? You don't have to. It's not showing up. There we go. Ooh. I like the blue squiggles.
I'm seeing out my window, I guess, and realizing like in the past I haven't had the sort of, we moved during COVID and I didn't have a view. I didn't have inspiration outside of my windows. And so that's like really affected the way that I've interpreted, the time that we've all been isolated, and the way that it's affected my work and the way that I show up to these virtual experiences as well. Like a window to the physical is in the exact same place as my window to the virtual.
Cool. So now that you're all warmed up, that was our like 5-minute gesture drawing. Now we're gonna map our phenomenal museum. And so this larger concept of creating a map of your mind, your culture, and your history of inspiration. And so, put down your pen. We're gonna go back in there. We're gonna go deeper into the sitting with the muse. And so close your eyes. And just bring your attention maybe to those influences that just helped you make that map. Charlotte, could you mute? There's some. Thanks. And as you sit with your drawing, you sit with the creative process. Whether you're an artist or a designer, professionally, or just simply interested, everyone is creative. It's not like some people know how to draw and some people don't know how to draw. Get in touch or just feel that creative spark inside of you that moved you to draw, that knew what to do. And sit with that energy, that impetus, that momentum. And listen to it. Listen to it like a breeze. Hey, creative energy. Where did you come from? And it's like you're calibrating your radio to the muse. I picked pink. I picked red. My line looked like that. Where did that line quality come from? And a painting might come to mind. A favorite artist might come to mind. And start to trace the provenance of your inspiration. I really was turned on to that color by this particular painting. And start to call in the constellation of muses that have inspired you in your creative process. Teachers, artists, writers, places, beings. And it starts to become this time-space weave around you. It's like filling an auditorium, an opera house, with your sources of inspiration, those forces that inspire you, that sing to you. And just sit with them. Acknowledge them. Connecting to your muse, your inspiration, is the beginning of countermapping. Acknowledging that you are the source of your world, not Google Maps. To give yourself the agency to know, to feel, to see, to hear. To decide for yourself what is real. Your experience is real. And it starts with listening. As you sit with your muses, notice how the muse becomes a mountain, how the muse intersects with the land. They are intertwined. It's an ancient observation that sources of inspiration are intertwined with the ground, with the land. And as you make an inventory of your sources of inspiration, notice how that inventory is also an inventory of place. And so, at any point, now that you've got this momentum going, you can just start drawing if you haven't already. Start making the map. Who's the first muse that you sat with? And which muse did that connect you to? As you start to make the map of your phenomenal museum. Your mind, how your mind receives culture, interfaces with culture. And just as you did with the virtual physical reality weave, how do those influences weave with the land? The two meanings of the muse as the mountain and the inspiration. And you can come up with your own legend, your own glyph system, mingling text and word, word and image. And as you counter map, you can say you're creating an alternate museum. Within your psyche, the one that's there. And so obviously this process takes more than 5 minutes. Hopefully you can keep building on this map. And finding different ways that the topography of place intersects with the muse. And so as you keep drawing, if anybody wants to share any images, you can email them to me, create@makeconscious.com, or you can ask questions in Q&A or chat. We have 5 minutes left, or keep drawing.
Looks like Jim mentioned that it really included sounds for him, which I can relate to. My second map was all sounds.
So make some music, Jim. For sure. Like, so much of maps are visual, right? So that how can we create sound maps, soundscapes?
Here, this was my sound map.
Ooh, wow, I love the tape. It feels like an audio tape.
Oh yeah, good connection.
And it was so fast. You did that so fast. Wait, put that back up.
So here was
Wow.
the sketch for it. And then
that's the final piece.
Yeah.
I can't believe you did that in like 5 minutes.
I have access to a lot of craft and design supplies right here.
Wow. I'm like, should I share my map? I didn't really make one. I made one earlier this morning. But
yeah, definitely share your map.
So before I share it, I did have just one thing to add in terms of like, well, what does that have to do with Indigenous stories, right? Because I'm like, is it a bit of how are these connected to that? And for me, when I first went into silence to create these maps of myself, my own self meditating, I mean, the last thing I expected was to meet the Apache stories. I mean, I'm with myself in a retreat cabin doing Buddhist stuff, and I ended up spending a year listening to Apache stories because it's Apache land. And so when you listen, you can't help but hear the indigenous stories. They're there, like the trees, the fox that would keep coming. It's like we'd be sitting and then there'd be like a story. Sometimes like actual words, sometimes teaching me their language through the wind and the trees. And you're like, whoa. And the modern mind has to quiet down before you can even receive that. Because otherwise, the indigenous story is just an anthropological exercise. It's still other, right? But if we get quiet enough, just learn to listen. It's not other, it's just part of the landscape. And so for me, the beginning of sharing this consciousness with modern brains like my own is start with your own sources of genius, the spirits of yourself that inspire you. And as you start to attune to that, the indigenous experience is inevitable. It's just opening to spirit. It's just opening to other forms of being in the world.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Looks like we just have about 2 minutes left. So I do encourage anybody that has any questions, please ask them. We've got a few links over here in the chat as well. I've pinned up at the top here an invitation to visit makeconscious.com, where you can learn a little bit more about the Phenomenal Museum structure and sort of watch as it evolves with our process. We would love for you to join along with us. And the Museum of Craft and Design is open. We are welcoming visitors into our space. We have 2 exhibitions, Encoded Holidays by Gary Hutton and Tom Bonaro, and Design by Time. And they are both really, really great, really worth checking out. And we're just really excited to have people back in our space.
Thanks, Charlotte. And if you guys want to I put up this info here, phenomenalmuseum.com, where we've just launched this week. And so if you find these processes exciting, interesting, we do them every morning, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. You can just join us, and we'll be doing other mapping workshops, something called Hilma Zoom Room, so working with Hilma off Klimt's work to rewrite art history, another form of counter mapping. And we'd love to just hear about your own process. So, email us, share your maps. Yeah.
See, it looks like Nikki's wondering if the video is shareable to the world outside of this platform. We're still finding out about getting video copies of all of these events. But do share send an email over to Jessica at create@makeconscious.com so that we can connect with you a little bit further.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Thanks, Nikki.
Yeah.
I feel reconnected. Thanks, Nikki.
Great.
Yeah, so let's see, I've got 39 seconds left.
Mhm.
So we would love, so what we're going to do is Museum of Craft and Design for the next year is starting to really do this type of listening with the land of Museum of Craft and Design and find what those stories are and countermap the museum.
Exactly.
And so we would love to, sign up for the Phenomenal Museum, and we will keep you involved in those processes. Because we will, as we do it with the museum, departments and administrators will be bringing in the public to countermap the actual site of the museum with us.
Great. Thank you. Bye.